All right, so I am lucky to be talking to Professor Matthew Winters from the University of Illinois, an expert in many things, but for our purposes, foreign aid. And so I've asked him to come on here and talk about the effectiveness of foreign aid, something that's going to be part of our class discussion for Intro to IR. And so I think it would be great if you could start off speaking a little bit about your research and how that applies to aid effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the literature on foreign aid is kind of grouped into aid allocation, where does foreign aid money go, and then aid effectiveness, what good does it do? And I've done a little bit of work in both of those places. My work on aid effectiveness has really been at the project level. So I think as this conversation goes on, we'll talk about some of the studies that have been done about if we study the overall amount of aid that countries are receiving, do we have evidence that receiving lots of money helps their economies grow faster or does other good things? And I've really focused in on individual aid projects and what makes them more or less likely to be successful. So the first project that I did, it was part of my dissertation research. I was very interested in corruption. I remain very interested in corruption. And one of the claims about foreign aid is that it suffers from a lot of corruption, that money goes missing within individual aid projects. And so I tried to think about what scenarios might make this more or less likely. And I came up with a theory that when aid projects are targeted to a very specific constituency, that can therefore monitor, is the money arriving, is the project doing what it's supposed to do, that should reduce the level of corruption in an individual project. And I spent a lot of time reading through World Bank documentation, trying to figure out if there had been corruption in individual projects, coding those projects for how well targeted they were or not, and the evidence supported that theory that I had come up with. The other aid effectiveness project that I've done more recently, research project that is still at the aid project level, and it's related to, I've been interested in the fact that for many aid projects, so you're trying to improve a country's health systems, and maybe that involves building some hospitals, maybe that involves doing some trainings for doctors, and maybe it involves doing some trainings for government officials. And there might be 3 or 4 different donors involved with that project. But it seems like there might be costs to having multiple different entities involved with any given project. And so the research that I did tried to look, again, in the context of projects where the World Bank was involved. Is it true that projects perform more poorly when there are more actors involved? And I've provided some evidence that that's true. It's not so strong that we should be really worried about it. But I entitled that article, "Too Many Cooks in the Kitchen." And there's a little bit of evidence that when there are too many cooks in the kitchen, there can be some problems.
Right. And that can go, this fits in nicely to my next question, because part of this, why I want to have a discussion with you is we're going to talk about the debates about aid effectiveness, but very much at the macro level, where, which is probably best epitomized by Jeffrey Sachs on one side, where he's pretty optimistic that aid is the answer to a lot of the world development problems. And then the other side, you have William Easterly, and he's pretty pessimistic. And one of the criticism he has is sort of there's a lot of redundancy in projects, and that's why aid is not always effective. But I was interested to where you come down in this debate, if you think it's a valid debate to begin with, but if you come on, if you're sympathetic to one side or the other, or somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, it's a debate where, you know, my own opinion has gone back and forth over time. There are many, you know, very intelligent scholars who are arguing either side of the debate, and so I found myself swayed by different evidence at different moments in time. one way that I think about it, tying it to this notion of project effectiveness, is what's been called the micro-macro paradox. That if we go around the world and we find some development project that's been funded by aid, we pick it up, we look at it, chances are it's performing well. That because of that foreign aid, children are getting educated, that children are getting vaccinated, that mothers are getting health care, that a new irrigation system is being built. Like, quite likely we'll see good outcomes from a given aid project. The problem has been that when we study, do countries that get more foreign aid grow faster, or do they experience greater declines in poverty? It's been really hard to find evidence that that's true. And so this micro-macro paradox has been, if we look at the micro level, things look good. But if we look at the macro level, that poor countries have been staying poor, haven't been seeing the types of improvements to quality of life that we might have expected. One of the things that's interesting from an academic perspective is that maybe this is due to what are called negative externalities. That yes, aid is doing good things in terms of what it's supposed to be doing, but the very fact that it's there leads to some bad things happening around it. So for instance, if foreign donors are doing what a government otherwise might be doing, does that lead people to check out from expressing their desires to the government, or from monitoring what the government is doing? Is foreign aid taking the most intelligent and capable people in a country and getting them to work for foreign aid donors rather than to work for the government? If those things are happening because of foreign aid projects, then that might explain this micro-macro paradox, that yes, the individual project does well, but the existence of that project means that these other bad things are happening, and therefore overall economic growth ends up stunted, ends up not as good as it could be. And so I find those arguments very persuasive, that here's the explanation for why, even though, yes, more kids are in school and getting vaccinated and mothers are going to new health clinics to get checkups, that nonetheless, we might not be seeing economic growth. And I think that's where it's easy to fall down on Easterly's side of things. In some ways, Sachs and Easterly represent this micro-macro paradox, where Sachs is saying, look, if we just put enough money into an individual project, that project can do all sorts of wonderful things. And Easterly is saying, well, no, like, because bad governments receive foreign aid, that lets them stay in power, and that's not good for people who have to live under those bad governments. The latest evidence, though, I think is consistently showing a small positive effect of aid, even at the macro level. It's not great. It's hard to say that aid really is saving countries, or that it is really spurring countries to economic development. But it does look like those countries that receive more aid do slightly better than those countries that receive less aid, once we try to account for all the differences between those countries in terms of why they're receiving that aid.
Great. So we're political scientists, so we don't necessarily want the economists to be in charge of this debate. So what do you think are some of the things that are missing from the debate that are essentially politics?
Yeah, it's something that's really important to keep in mind with foreign aid, and we've known this for a long time. I'd like to think the economists know it too. I think Easterly certainly does think about this, but that is, the whole creation of the foreign aid system was maybe less about development and more about geopolitics. It was more about fighting the Cold War, about having a reason to give money to countries to try to keep them from not going communist. And development is tied up in that, right? There's a legitimate view that if you can bring economic development to a place, that revolutionary movements will be less likely to succeed. But a lot of the foreign aid money in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s was about bribing governments, right? It was about trying to get them to change their policies and to stay on one side or the other during the Cold War. And so it's important to keep that in mind when trying to figure out does aid work? So a very good paper by a pair of political scientists, David Bearse and Dan Tyrone, says the types of reforms that aid was used to promote during the Cold War period just weren't credible, because the governments in aid receiving countries that were supposed to be changing the way that their economies worked, they didn't think that the donors were actually going to cut off the aid, because they knew the game that was being played.
Yeah.
But once we get into the 1990s, post-Cold War, then there's a more credible threat to actually cut off aid and punish a country that doesn't reform. And so what Bearse and Tyrone found was that, in fact, post-Cold War aid appeared more successful at catalyzing economic reform and thereby catalyzing economic growth. And you can only see that if you're paying attention to the geopolitical logic of aid.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you an unfair question. I'm going to ask you to predict something, essentially, just instead of explain something. So we're recording this on March 25th, and the world is kind of coming apart. And the United States governments and European governments are trying to figure out how they're going to bail themselves out. I'm interested in your thoughts on how foreign aid moves on from here because of this, I guess, almost near certain recession the global economy is going to head into.
Yeah, I did a little bit of looking at a similar question at the time of the 2008 financial crisis, where I wrote about how the World Bank responded to that crisis. And so one thing to keep in mind is that this big term foreign aid refers to a lot of things. And so one thing it refers to is bilateral aid programs, money that comes from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Japan. And frankly, those programs are going to be under threat. It's very hard to justify giving money abroad when there are major problems at home. Foreign aid is almost always under threat, and even more so in times of financial crisis. Then we have multilateral organizations. So the World Bank that I've mentioned a few times, different regional development banks, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, some specialized entities that try to address particular problems. So UNICEF, the World Health Organization could fall into this category. And what we saw in 2008, 2009 was a lot of activity by those multilateral organizations. So the World Bank, for instance, is able to raise money on bond markets. It can sell bonds that are viewed more or less like US Treasury bills are, which is that they're viewed as a very safe investment. And so the World Bank can almost always raise more money. And so during the 2008 financial crisis, the World Bank started giving a lot of money to middle income countries to help them stabilize their economies. And I suspect that we'll see a similar pattern coming up, where these large multilateral organizations, so both the IMF and the World Bank, will put new lending streams in place to help countries get through a rough patch, so that they can keep paying off their debts, so that they can maintain the value of their currency, so that they can really deal with potential macroeconomic problems. There's also a lot of room, of course, for individual level projects. So I think the World Bank has opened up a window where if countries have a health project that could help them address the coronavirus threat, that money flows much more quickly right now than it would in normal times. And I suspect that some of the bilateral donors are doing something similar. As we've seen, this is a global pandemic, right? And that means that what's happening in faraway places is actually really relevant for what's happening at home, and therefore foreign aid has a potentially very big role to play here if you can do things to make sure that similar quarantining procedures and health procedures are taking place in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, even Easterly, who's the very pessimist of foreign aid, will admit that foreign aid can be effective on these type of health issues, and so it'd be so I don't see it going away, and this is the time where countries probably need it the most. But the politics surrounding it in the U.S. and in Europe are going to be pretty interesting in the next year or so.
Yeah, definitely. The UK has been interesting because even during the Brexit debate and some other moments where the economy hasn't been looking so good, they have maintained relatively high levels of foreign aid giving. The United Kingdom meets this global target that all countries give 0.7% of their gross domestic product as foreign aid. The United States is nowhere near that target, but the UK has been pretty consistent about that. And so I think it's a domestic politics story where when there's good leadership and real commitment to maintaining foreign aid expenditures, that actually they can persist through economic hard times.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see. Well, thank you so much for this discussion. I wish we were in person in some conference talking about this, but this is going to be useful for my class.